A game warden walks onto a Pennsylvania farm. No warrant, no complaint, no reason given. He asks the hunter to produce his license, and the license is in his truck. That is not good enough. The fine gets written. And for 19 years, Pennsylvania's own Supreme Court held that the Commonwealth's Constitution permitted this. On July 21st of this year, that court reversed itself, and it did so unanimously. This week, we have been tracing Sir Edward Coke and his insistence that the common law controls the crown. Today, I sit down with Brian Peltier, who is asking Pennsylvania legislators to accept that same limit on itself. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is the interview episode for Week 8 of our series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. This conversation is a capstone of the week. This past Sunday, we published the written piece on our website. On Saturday, we told the history. On Tuesday, we brought it into the present. And now on Thursday, we closed the week with a living voice. Coke made his case from that floor of the House of Commons. Brian farms the ground the case was about. Brian is a Libertarian candidate for Pennsylvania's 60th House District in Armstrong and Westmoreland counties. He spent 24 and a half years in the Navy, worked as a regulatory agent at Naval Reactors, and after 12 moves decided to stop moving and raise cows and sheep and goats and chickens and turkeys outside of Leechburg. He has a daughter serving in the Navy now, and that background matters this week because Coke's 4 grievances in the Petition of Right, taxation without consent, imprisonment without cause shown, soldiers quartered in private homes, and martial law over civilians map almost exactly onto the 4 things Brian is running on. Brian filed his nomination papers before Pennsylvania's August 3rd deadline, and the results are not yet in at the time of this recording. You will hear in this conversation what that took. And there are 2 threads to follow. The first is Coke's oldest one, whether government owes you a reason before it crosses your property line. Pennsylvania answered that question in July. Brian has been living it for years. The second is quieter and harder, and it is the arithmetic of getting onto a ballot in this Commonwealth at all. We spent the first stretch of this conversation on Iran, where Brian's naval background does work no historian can do for us. The House has twice passed a resolution to end this war. The Senate passed one in June with 4 Republicans crossing, and then killed another one in July. Pennsylvania's own Senator John Fetterman has been repeatedly voting against them. So let us get to it. Here's my conversation with Brian Peltier.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions Podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
Thank you. We're pleased to be joined here today by Brian Peltier. Brian is running for the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives in District 60, right, Brian?
That's correct.
Awesome. You know, what we're doing here, this episode is airing on Thursday, August the 6th. We're going to talk about some of the logistics of the race. We're going to talk about some of the issues that Brian is very passionate about. Brian's had a very active presence in social media talking about these issues throughout his campaign, and he'll continue to do so the rest of the time here that we go throughout. So we definitely want to touch on those issues. And it's very interesting. I wanted Brian on this week because of the tie-in to Coke and what has happened in our historical episode and what we touched on the contemporary application episode on Tuesday. So very happy to have Brian on. Brian, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about yourself a little bit. What got you interested in running? And what are you doing right now in Pennsylvania? Talk a little bit about your family and where they're at and what you're doing up on your farm up there in District 60.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. So I'm Brian Peltier. I was in the Navy for 24 and a half years and lived all over the country. And then the Navy put me down here in Western Pennsylvania. And after moving 12 times, we decided just to not move anymore and stay here. I have a farm here in Pennsylvania. We have livestock with cows, sheep, goats, chickens, and turkeys. And I've been working in the energy and nuclear engineering field since my time in the Navy concluded. With my experience, I've been looking at different opportunities for kind of how to serve going forward. And one of the big things I have for a concern in my life is I have a daughter that's currently in the Navy, kind of following my footsteps. And in that, we have a lot of things in the world going on right now. And I want to put some checks and balances in place such that the world we have going forward makes a whole lot more sense and it is more aligned with the Constitution that we originally, all signed off when we left the UK.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, Brian. We'll come and we'll tie this into the history here in a minute, but we want to talk about current events too, and a little bit of transparency for the audience. Brian and I are recording this about 10 days ahead of when it's airing, so I'm sure there will be some occurrences that happen in foreign policy and with the war going on in Iran between now and then. But let's talk about a little bit at a high level. So, Brian, you have some unique qualifications. You understand the naval warfare that's happening now, and you also understand some of the messaging that's going on regarding the nuclear threat that the president is claiming that Iran has. So, what are your thoughts? It's interesting. In the past week, we had Jamie Remy on, and I know you know Jamie, and we're very happy to have you on right after Jamie, and also right after John Thomas the past couple of weeks. So this has been a great 3-week segment of Pennsylvania politicians and standing up for the Libertarian Party in Pennsylvania. So really happy about that. But I know you know Jamie, and last week we talked about Grotius and the free movement across the sea. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that too, with your background in the Navy. What are your thoughts on the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, what's happening right now also with the entryway from the Gulf of Aden into the Red Sea? I'm sure you have some thoughts on those actions that are happening.
Yeah. So a lot of people downplay a blockade, but it is an act of war because if you starve a populace of all their goods and supplies and free trade, that populace does not have a means to succeed. We have people that won't get goods and services and that will be deprived of their own liberties because of actions taken by our government as well as the government of Iran. It puts everyone in the world stage as a big stalemate because those ports of travel are some of the most used ports in the world. Between entering the Suez and then entering the Persian Gulf and the area around Iran, we ship a lot of the world's oil. We ship, surprisingly, the majority of the world's helium, which is a resource that a lot of people don't even think of, and as well as natural gas production and other things. And it also impacts fertilizer. And fertilizer is the backbone of farmers all across the United States since we shifted away from natural fertilizer and went to a man-made fertilizer.
Yeah, and that's something again fits right into your area of expertise here. One of the issues that I think we've seen over the spring and summer is we haven't really felt the pain at the pump to the scale that most of us thought we would. And I think that's because a lot of the strategic reserves globally, not just in the United States, but globally, have been dwindled down to make sure that they can compensate for the lack of oil and natural gas that are coming in. Plus the fact that it's summertime in the Northern Hemisphere, we're not using a lot of that energy consumption the oil and natural gas consumption that we use for heat in the wintertime. So that's a pressure point we'll see coming as the year goes on. But the fertilizer that's not getting out, the necessary component pieces to make fertilizer, that's got to be affecting us now. Is that correct? And how's that going to bear out in the fall and the harvest season?
So I work in I have a livestock farm, but I need to get hay in order to feed all my animals because my farm's not big enough to be self-sustaining in that regard. And the farmers that I've talked to, fertilizer's gone up, like in some cases, depending when you buy it, nearly double from last year. And they have to pass that cost on to the consumer. That coupled with the increase in diesel prices over the past year, diesel is the lifeblood of every farmer because all the equipment runs on diesel, has equated to an increase in just hay for me for this year. And the price of my hay farmer hasn't changed, honestly, in probably 5 years. So that was a pretty big change this year. And that's going to equate to the end of the harvest season where we're going to see like increased grocery prices for sure.
So we're going to see increased energy prices. That's unavoidable now at this point as the reserves have gone down. And yes, I know a lot of people are saying, but guys, we're seeing gas prices already in the $4 range. That's really a drop in the bucket. It's going to go higher when we really can't even tap into those reserves. So we're going to see that coupled with rising food costs. And then we're also talking about the other types of pressures on the monetary supply for inflation. This is not boding well for us going into the fall and going into the winter. Even if this conflict, if this war were to end today, to unwind all of this is quite a dilemma for us.
It is. And one thing people don't realize, even if today we decided that today's the war's going to end and we're all done and we have a ceasefire, in order to demine all the areas, it's going to take months. So we will have some amount of free travel, but a lot of the travel would have to be completely demined, and that's going to slow everything down. And then, God forbid, someone hits a mine after the treaty's done, and then that probably would start the whole process all over again.
Yeah, that's the logistics of this are very daunting, even at this point. And one of the things that we talk about, and full disclosure, Brian and I are friends. We meet on different occasions, and we do talk about the current events that are happening. We talked a little bit about the dilemma that the administration has put us in at this point. Historically, we have what's called a Wars Powers Act, and the War Powers Act right now legislatively gives the executive branch an opportunity to respond to an imminent threat. There are certain conditions that when that can be invoked, and that the president can actually respond militarily to an event. It was never meant for a preemptive war, but this administration has used that. And then this administration also put another precedent in place where during a ceasefire, they called that a cessation of the war and then a re-engagement of the war here just a couple of weeks ago, all for the purposes of restarting that 60-day clock. What are your thoughts on that, Brian? I know you have some thoughts from a libertarian, from a freedom lover standpoint. Would you like to add on to that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the points that I think gets overlooked on that too is the cost of service members' lives, because depending on which news source you look at, the ceasefire is putting it such that the numbers for the deaths for the war for U.S. service members and injuries, at one point the White House were saying that resets that clock as well. So it almost becomes like a propaganda machine where you think like, oh, only a couple people have died. And now the numbers like in the 20s, and we have hundreds upon hundreds of service members that are injured. Couple that with the fact that the VA under the Trump administration wants to change what the payouts are for injuries for service members over the course of their lifetime and reduce that for certain disabilities, which are very common, like hearing loss. That would be a true disservice to everyone that's actually fighting right now. But everyone's kind of okay with it as the status quo, which is unfortunate.
Well, one of the other component pieces on this, when we think about the political pressure to disengage from these conflicts, to not engage in the first place, to make sure that the power to declare war is actually handed back to the Congress. And the reason why we talk about this a lot is there is definitely more accountability. And we haven't declared a war since World War II, I believe. Harry Truman was the first one to take the precedent from the Korean War and move it away from the legislative branch into the executive branch, and they followed suit every single time since then. There is an effort to push that back into legislative hands, and one of the best ways that we can do that actually comes from the state. And this actually ties back into what we were talking about in this week's historical episode with Koch and the case of proclamations and forcing the legislature to be bound by the law. And to do that, I know you're very passionate about it. I'm very passionate about it. Our guest last week, Jamie Remy, is very passionate about the Defend the Guard legislation. And it's something that puts this back into the state's hands. As a potential legislator for the state of Pennsylvania, is that something that you will be pushing as part of your agenda?
Absolutely. That's like probably top 2 in my list of legislation I want to push in Pennsylvania.
And what that does is if you could just kind of walk us through a little bit, that the idea is, right, that it forces the governor to make the decision that the legislature, the federal legislature, is walking through the correct legal steps in the case of a war in order to call National Guard troops up. Do I have that right?
Yes, and there's a lot of misnomers about the president activating the National Guard. He has to actually formally federalize the National Guard. And in order to do that, the articles that are generally quoted are the threat of an actual invasion. So having a foreign war doesn't constitute invasion, but it's always been, if you look at the rhetoric that's been spit out by the executive branch, not just over Trump, but over the past couple of years, it's always, we need to do this because of some unknown threat. So we're constantly afraid of the boogeyman, and that's always how we kind of get to the point where the president can now use the National Guard because it's somehow related to a potential invasion that's, never going to occur, whereas the National Guard is supposed to guard, our states and our sovereignty at home.
Yeah, and the National Guard does so many things domestically. If the National Guard is deployed, that really strains the resources that we can handle here domestically as well. Whether it's state of emergency, whether it's foreign intrusion, the things that a National Guard is actually meant here to be.
Absolutely.
One of the that's a piece of legislation. And by the way, I know not every one of our listeners is in the state of Pennsylvania. It is a great state. We welcome you to move here, especially when we have representatives like Brian in office. But Defend the Guard is a national movement, and we're trying to get it into all 50 states. So there is a chapter in your own state. You can definitely be active. Once you see how this actually helps the entire process, it is something we, at a grassroots level, we should all be involved with to make sure that our states are actually holding the federal government to account. That's going forward, Brian. One of the things that happened here recently in Pennsylvania, I know it's something that you've campaigned on a lot, is the open fields doctrine. So, and when we talked about Koch in the historical episode, one of the key points, as Old Man Koch was up there talking in the House of Commons, made it very clear that the English monarchy could not go in and trespass into homes, all the way down to the lowest peasant in the 17th century English land. That, of course, would carry over a century and a half later to our founders, who would then enshrine that as the Fourth Amendment. One of the areas of contention that happened in Pennsylvania was a Supreme Court decision several years ago that was just overturned this summer. And I know you've been following it very closely. Would you like to share a little bit of that with our listeners here to let them know what happened in Pennsylvania and the good news that happened just last week?
Yeah, so in case you're unfamiliar with open fields, basically the idea is that the government can come on your property as long as they don't go on what's considered your curtilage, which is the area just around your house. So for small landowners, it generally doesn't really apply because the houses are usually so close together that you're going on someone's property, regardless. But for large landowners and especially farmers, we're always disproportionately affected because at any point the government, and in a lot of cases here in Pennsylvania, the Game Commission, can come on your property without a warrant just to kind of see what you're doing and basically find a way to fine you or arrest you without any probable cause or a warrant. In a lot of cases, the Game Commission, during hunting season here, will go out and say, like, hey, do you have your hunting license on you? Like, even if it's in your car, because, like, you're in your house, that's unfortunately unsatisfactory for them, and you'll receive a hefty fine. And recently, a hunting club in Pennsylvania appealed this decision to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and it was overturned a week ago for this kind of exact same scenario. The one thing I want to do, if elected, is kind of strengthen open fields doctrine and make it more broad, because a lot of people have concerns now with flock cameras as well as streetlight cameras, which, in addition to just monitoring public land, in a lot of cases are monitoring private land and also monitoring electronic media and facial recognition and other things, which if the founders knew like what the technology was and how it could be utilized today, I think they'd be frankly appalled by its use. And I actually have found one person petitioning so far which defended flock cameras, which was surprising. And the whole guise for him was like, well, it keeps everyone safe. And so I would rather be free, than safe, because freedom is where things are important.
Yeah, yeah. I'm reminded, of course, of the Ben Franklin axiom. Trading liberty for security, and you get none. You get neither, right? Um, it's a great point and a great tie into flock cameras, and it's something that has hit the news all summer long, rightfully so. I come from the video surveillance industry as part of my background. I do believe that video surveillance can be a great tool for private property and private owners. The difference with flock is the data that's collected is sent to a nationalized database, oftentimes sent without the municipality's knowledge, which is why we're seeing a lot of municipalities now pulling flock cameras when they realize that data is being sent to a national database and it's being sent off to other agencies, not even without any legislation, by the way, protecting that from even going to foreign nations. I'm not saying that that's happening, but there's no protections in place to prevent that right now. Now, tie this back to the open field side of it. We've had municipalities installing these cameras and others, flock and other cameras, onto private property as a means for a dragnet or security, saying, "Oh, we're trying to capture other criminals and other criminal activity," but it's not government property; it's private property. And without this overturned by the Supreme Court that happened here this month, they were able to do that. They were able to go onto private property and install these devices.
Yeah, and as far as like use and abuse of this technology, even at like a local level now, police. There's been many cases of police just stalking people, stalking like women that they're attracted to or their ex-wives or other things, which is a complete misuse of taxpayer time and our money.
Yeah, and that's really when we talk about a lot of non-libertarians, a lot of the normies out there. They look at it and say, well, shouldn't we give law enforcement every tool at their disposal? They might need it someday. They might be able to. The problem with that is exactly what you just said. With great power comes the ability for corruption. And when you enable something without proper regulation, without proper protections in place that were vetted through the legislature, that were given with the consent of the governed, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago on the show, it creates an opportunity for malfeasance. And we've seen that. There's been documented cases, hundreds of documented cases, just what Brian just said, of using those cameras to stalk individuals, using those cameras for other nefarious purposes. If they've got a grudge against somebody, they want to be able to use it to potentially capture something that they can then go back and hold them, whether it's extort them or use that for their own reasons. That's not what security is meant to be. You need to have those protections in place, and this right now does not have those protections in place. Fortunately, the Supreme Court came around and reversed the decision. I believe the first decision, and I'll have to look back through my notes, but I believe the first decision was somewhere around 2007. Is that right, Brian?
I'd have to check, but that sounds about right to me.
Yeah, so this, and I should also mention that this reversal, and we'll have a link down in the comments below with a couple of news articles. This was a unanimous decision by the state Supreme Court. So this wasn't a partisan effort where it just came down to one vote. This was a unanimous decision, which again bodes very well for the state of Pennsylvania. So, Brian, one of the other issues that we talked about with Jamie Remy last week, and even with John Thomas, is this idea of what libertarians do to get on the ballot. And it's a different process than Republicans or Democrats. And you and I know we talked to a lot of individuals that are of the Republican Party or Democratic Party or independents, and they say, well, if libertarianism is such a great idea, and I know we believe it is, and we believe our founders believed it was, But if it's such a great idea, why aren't there more libertarian representatives? Why are libertarians pushing these other parties that we know have such unfavorable opinions, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party? Why aren't they pushing them out and making hay? And part of the reason is structural. It is very difficult to get a third party, any third party, on the ballot. And I know that's something you're struggling with right now. Talk a little bit about the hoops that you have to go through to actually get on the ballot.
Yeah, so I know John talked a little bit the other week about the signature process and the challenges associated with that. In addition to the signature process, one of the other things associated with that is the 2% rule. So in a lot of cases, depending on the office, and the office I'm running for is one of them, you also, even to get ballot access, need to get at least 2% of the signatures of the highest candidate in the previous election. So in a case where, hey, someone ran unopposed, and so they're the only person you could pick, they got all the votes on election day, and now the candidates for the next election cycle, to get on the ballot, you have to get 2% of that person's vote, even if they ran unopposed. So in my case, typically the signature threshold is around 300 signatures for state rep. I have to get, I think it's 615 signatures, so more than double the threshold that a normal person would have to get on for access to the ballot. And because we're a third party, we're treated differently, and we're beholden to this rule, where in many cases the other parties are not, and they do not have the same burden of proof that the people want something different than the Libertarian Party has. And so in general, like, for the Libertarian Party could put up candidates everywhere if these thresholds didn't exist, or they were lowered to like a more reasonable amount. But because of that, it's a huge burden for everyone. And petitioning for signatures can be exhausting, especially for me, where a lot of the people I live around are actually in a rural area. So that means like driving sometimes miles between houses to door knock and then find out people aren't there. There are neighborhoods and other things like that in my area. I'm not going to say there's not. But if the demographics of your area are more sparse, it makes the whole petitioning process harder. And in many cases, you're not allowed to petition in the places you think because they are private property. So it makes things a lot more different. And I think also, like, I'm not sure if John talked about this, but overall, like, the vibe after COVID and talking to people is much more different because as a society, we've become more introverted in our nature, where we look at our phones for like human communication rather than talking in person these days. And in many cases, especially with younger people, I go to talk to them and they're almost like afraid to talk to me.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I also think that, and one of the things that we're trying to do, our show, many other shows that, and all of our friends in the libertarian movement are trying to give more information to people that just aren't aware of what libertarianism is. And so a lot of people will have misconceptions, preconceived notions about what a libertarian candidate is like, and they don't realize what we're trying to do. So trying to get all of that to them while getting their signature is a challenge, because we don't have the opportunity to go into debates with the other candidates, not having an opportunity to sit there and have town halls with those candidates. It's really all incumbent on the candidate themselves to try and get that out there. And what that leaves then from a fundraising standpoint is you have to put the majority of your resources up front into the signature gathering phase, as opposed to actually in the campaign phase, where you can actually give that information about those issues to the voters. So the education movement actually is stalled a little bit because we're spending so much time and resources on signature gathering. And as you said, it's a burden that third parties have to face that the major two parties do not as they go through the primary process. Very good. So, Brian, we talked a little bit about your military background. We talked a little bit about your expertise within the district, the fact that you've come up here to Pennsylvania, that you really have made a home here in Pennsylvania, that you see a lot of the issues that your neighbors are facing. What what message do you want to give to the rest of your district as they consider you to be their representative?
That's a good question. I would say my motto of my campaign has always been protect the land, and a lot of the things I'm pushing for are such that we can free up farmers in the whole state of Pennsylvania. Obviously, I'm looking targetedly at District 60. I also want to start pulling back and having more rights for individuals within the state. There's so many dumb laws and dumb things we do just to like shoot ourselves in the foot. We can free up the markets easily by like ending the state monopoly on selling liquor. We can move forward and actually have privatized stores. We can stop the whole ban on selling cars on Sundays. We can stop the whole ban on hunting on Sundays, and just look at more of like our personal freedoms. And then as far as like at a personal level, one thing I've talked to a couple people before on other interviews and stuff is just the position of state rep in and of itself is actually very limited in the fact that it only works 40 to 50 days a year. And so a lot of people have asked me, like, what are you going to do with your other time outside of that? Because that's actually not a lot of time. If you think about it, that's like a couple days a month you're actually working. And one of my passion projects that I've had concerns about is local to here is the shallow lands disposal area in the Apollo area, where a company, NUMEC, buried nuclear fuel directly in the ground without any regulations or anything, and the local public is berated with cancer for the past 20 years. It has like the highest cancer rates in all of Pennsylvania, and in many cases, more than different parts of the entire United States. Because of that, I have a background. I was a regulatory agent for the government in my time in the Navy, specifically at Naval Reactors. I will make it my passion project to protect the people here in District 60 such that they will not be affected by the next major disaster here and suffer cancers going forward. I'll do everything in my power to make sure that that does not happen.
The other note that we should make is that as a candidate, I know you've talked about working with other legislators, whether they're on the Republican Party or the Democrat Party, to make sure that some common sense actually comes back to Harrisburg. You mentioned about the fact that it really is a part-time schedule. You know, even with our federal legislators, it was always viewed as it should be a part-time position, and yet it's become really a full-time position and then some, with the amount of money and resources that go into these legislative salaries, the staffing salaries. And I know that's also been a passion of yours, is kind of understanding how much money goes into a congressional office.
Yeah. So to break it down real quick, there's 203 state representatives. They get a salary of $112,000 a year. They get a staff of 4 to 5 people. They get their own car. They get per diem. They get perks throughout the state. They get offices throughout the Commonwealth. They also get offices in Harrisburg. And the tax burden for the Pennsylvania taxpayer ends up being a couple $100 million a year just to have this position that only works 40 to 50 days a year.
Wow. To bring it back to Koch, Koch talked about taxation without representation, and his way of saying it, basically no taxation without consent. I live in Pennsylvania. I don't consent to this. So we definitely want legislators that are in place to help us correct that. One of the other things that I know we've talked about, we both are very friendly with John Thomas. We're friendly with Ken Krawchuk. We know that campaign is going on. Were there to be a Krawchuk administration, his policies, are there policies of his that definitely align with yours that you would be supporting him on in Harrisburg?
Definitely the cutting of property tax as much as possible. I know he has a pretty drastic plan. I'd like to see how it be implemented. I think it would be really good. I know a lot of people I talk to out here, especially the elderly, are disproportionately affected by property taxes. And it's a case, I look at it as like We just need to figure out the way to fund it and make it happen. I have a couple ideas, but they're much more gradual than Ken's as far as like looking at projects. I have a background in project management as well. Like if I went to your house and it was a 2-story house and I said, I'll fix your roof for 30 grand and it's a harder project and you said, okay, that's fine. And then like I finished the project and I said, okay, the bill's now 65 grand because it costs way more than I thought because I'm a bad estimator. No one would accept that. But if you're building a road or a bridge or whatever in Pennsylvania, that's all fine and dandy, and we'll just push that expense onto the taxpayer, and it's fine. And that's completely bogus. Anything over 120% of costs needs to be investigated. That's the bottom line, and that's how we fix all these cost overruns and lower taxes. Is investigate like why we're spending way more on these projects than we're ever meant to be.
Yeah, yeah, I concur wholeheartedly. It is certainly an issue, and it really goes back again to accountability from the legislators that are there. They need to be holding the vendors accountable. They need to be holding the budgets accountable, and that's one thing that we haven't seen. And again, we go back to some of the systemic challenges of getting third parties in to challenge the incumbents. There's a number of districts that are run throughout the state that really go without a challenger and lead to the scenario that we talked about earlier. It is something that I think all of us should be more involved with, our local politics or state politics. Again, if you're not even listing in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, if you're in other states, look to your district. Know who your district representative is. Hold them accountable. That's your job as a citizen, is to hold them accountable. So it enables more change that we look for and be able to have representation for the people. Brian, thank you so much for being here with us this week. This is the first time. Hopefully it won't be the last. Hopefully you'll come on the show many more times. We'll talk about some of these advancements. We'll talk about other issues that are happening in Pennsylvania and the nation and the overall liberty movement. Is there anything else you'd like to say? Where can people find out more information about you? Where can they find out information about your campaign?
Yeah, so I have a website, Peltier4pa.com, and 4 is spelled out as letters, not as the number 4. And I have the same on Facebook and on TikTok. My daughters actually make fun of me a lot now that I'm on TikTok, but that's fine.
And those links you'll see them on the screen right now, and you'll also see them down below in the comments to make sure that you can get access and reach out to Brian, help him during his campaign. And then also, as we continue to talk about issues that go beyond this campaign season into the next year, we'll continue to promote those so that you can see them in the local districts inside of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much, Brian. We'll look forward to talking with you next time. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Jeff.
Welcome back. That was my conversation with Brian Peltier, and I want to take a few minutes to digest what we've heard. Brian brought something this week I could not have taken from the archive when he said that a blockade is an act of war because a starved population has no means to succeed. The question is, the blockade is meant to produce uproar, distress from the people inside that country if you are trying to get a regime change, which we know that's what this blockade is trying to do. The question is, if the people themselves have no means to succeed, they have no means to feed themselves, they are starving. They cannot uprise. They cannot take over the regime. The regime hoards what limited resources the country has. Those resources are not distributed out to the people. The regime becomes the last one standing. And therefore, to try and topple a regime with a popular uprising in the wake of a siege or a blockade is false logic. Brian also traced the line from what a closed strait does to realistically to the price of fertilizer, the price of hay, and what neighbors will pay for groceries this fall. Aside from the energy costs, we're also going to be talking about the food costs. So we trace what a distant decision does all the way from halfway across the world to our specific kitchens. And on Saturday, we watched Koch argue that a man's house is his castle and that the crown owed him a reason before crossing that threshold. On Tuesday, we'd asked what happens when a court is the one that has the say-so. Well, Brian gave us a third thing that neither episode could reach. a landowner who has been on the receiving end of the doctrine and who could describe the warden at the fence line. And on the liberty test, Brian got to our question before I did. When he said he would rather be free than safe, he answered it. So let me take it somewhere he did not. On the show, we always close by asking one thing we examine: did this leave people more free or more governed? This week, Pennsylvania produced both answers. I take the hard case against my own position first. Game wardens have to be able to walk onto open land because poaching is real and a deer herd is a genuine common concern. If every entry onto a field required a warrant, wildlife enforcement in a state this rural would become mostly theoretical. That's not a frivolous objection, and it's close to the Commonwealth's own case. But the court did not forbid entry. It required a reason. Cause shown is exactly what Koch demanded of the Stewarts, and this summer all 7 justices found it in a word that had been sitting in Pennsylvania's own Declaration of Rights this entire time: possessions. So more free, unambiguously, and against the Commonwealth's own agency. Now the other answer. To reach the ballot as a Libertarian in Brian's district, he needed roughly double the signatures a major party candidate needs, because the threshold is set at a share of last winter's vote total. The strongest case for a rule like that is real. A ballot with 40 names on it serves nobody, and a state may fairly ask a candidate to demonstrate that somebody wants him there. Here's what that defense cannot survive. The threshold rises with the previous winner's margin. An incumbent who ran unopposed collects every vote cast, and the next challenger has to clear a bar built out of that absence of competition. The rule turns its own success into a higher wall. It is not measuring support, it is compounding incumbency. That is more governed. And notice which institution fixed the problem and which one owns the second. Warrantless entry fell to a court reading a constitution. The signature threshold is a statute, and the only body that can repeal it is the body it protects. Koch spent his life arguing that common law controls the crown. He never resolved the harder version, which is what controls the legislature. Next week, meet the men who took Koch's logic further than Koch was willing to. They wrote a constitution for England in 1647 before there was an America to write one for, and then they argued at Putney over the question Brian and I circled all hour: who gets a voice and who decides? Next week, the journey continues with the levelers, the history on Saturday, its application on Tuesday, and another conversation to close the week, this time with a journalist, a modern-day pamphleteer. If you are in Pennsylvania, find out who represents your district and then find out whether anyone is running against them. Until then, keep asking the question that matters. Did this leave us more free or more governed? I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been Consequential Actions. Until next time, have a great day.